The Omoda C9 has arrived in Malaysia with one target on its mind: every single reconditioned Toyota Harrier on sale. Now, under the bonnet of the Omoda C9 is the 2-litre 4-cylinder engine that we've seen before from the Chery Tiggo 8 Pro. However, output numbers have been massaged ever so slightly, so it produces a little bit more power and a little bit more torque, producing 261 PS and 400 Newton meters. Now, that power can either go to the front wheels or all 4 wheels via an 8-speed automatic gearbox. That's right, there is no double clutch automatic in this. This is a proper torque converter 8-speed, which means that progress in this should be significantly smoother than what we've seen before from the Chery Tiggo 8 Pro. But of course, the biggest selling factor with the Omoda C9 is undoubtedly its looks. Now, the C9 is a D-segment SUV, which means that in terms of dimensions, it is broadly similar to what we've seen again from the Chery Tiggo 8 Pro, as well as vehicles like the Mazda CX-8, etc., although its closest competitor in terms of packaging is actually the Toyota Harrier. At very nearly 5 meters long, this car is enormous, and it's also incredibly wide, meaning that not only does it have incredible space inside, but it's also got significant presence on the outside. That is also underscored by the fact this car has very distinctive styling. For example, the daytime running light signature on this car is referred to as the Sigma light signature because it goes from here all the way up and all the way across and then all the way back down again to the furthest corner of the car, making it look distinctly like nothing else out there. You also get very prominent Omoda badging here, which bridges the 2 headlights, which also come with matrix LED technology, although for the life of me I don't know how to switch them on. And then further down you also get the very latest iteration of Omoda's corporate grille, where you get these sort of diamond patterns that sort of bleed out into the bumper and sort of feed in air towards the middle, which I think look absolutely fantastic. There are also some slightly more aerodynamic trickery down here, although these air breathers here do nothing. So these don't feed air over the side or over the front wheels either. They're just sort of there for design, although overall I don't find this offensive in the slightest. In fact, I think the Omoda C9 looks really good from this angle. And that same sense of distinctive design extends to the side, where you have this relatively gentle coupe-like roofline, but it still ultimately looks like an SUV. Now, in terms of rolling stock, those are handled by a set of 20-inch alloy wheels wrapped in Michelin E-Primacy tires, which are not only very good performers in the wet and dry, but they're also pretty good at maintaining a lower din or lesser road noise, and that's very, very clear from inside the cabin, although we'll touch on that a little bit later. Now, because Chery in China is actually a joint venture partner with Land Rover, because Land Rover and Jaguar products in China are built by Chery, and so they have actually taken some inspiration from some cars and then bled that onto their own cars. So for example, we have this piece of trim here which looks identical to the one that you get on the Range Rover Velar, and you also get the flush door handles that were again first popularized by the Range Rover Velar. But aside from that, the overall side profile of this car is distinct, it is unique, and it is very clearly something different. And I think that for buyers within this segment, different is important, because otherwise, everyone just drives the same car. D-segment SUV buyers tend to generally gravitate towards the Mazda CX-8 or the Toyota Harrier. And at this price point, that also means a reconditioned Toyota Harrier. And so if you want to look different and look distinctive, this is certainly it. And of course, this matte grey paintwork also helps, although this is a cost option, but it is a cost option worth taking. The back end is also just as distinctive as the front, because you get full LED taillights replete with a light bar, and both the front and rear lights do a little dance every time you lock and unlock the car, which I think looks quite good. You can also customize that lighting sequence through the IHU in the car, which means that you can actually get the car to do a specific light dance that you prefer, if that's your thing. Now, because this is a coupe-like SUV, that's why you have a very steep rake to this rear windscreen. And also, talking about the color and the paint of this car, I genuinely thought that matte paint would then allow it to sort of hide dirt a little bit better, but it seems that wherever the water has been able to sit and dry looks really gross. But anyway, beside that, you have a bit more complex surfacing down here, and I appreciate the fact the badging on this car is very, very restrained. You just have Omoda badging here and C9 badging here. That's it. This is very different from what you get from, say, a GWM product of any variety, where they try to put as many badges as possible for whatever reason necessary. Now, moving further down, you get a little bit more of that unpainted black plastic in order to give this car some slightly off-roadery vibes, but then you find the quad exhaust tips which are fake, because the exhausts on this car actually point downwards. These are not even exhaust tips or even exhaust exits. They are just there for design alone. And that's quite unfortunate, because this car does actually have dual exit exhausts. Why don't you just pipe them through like you can on the Tigo 8 Pro? Now, besides that, you actually have a pretty good amount of space behind this tailgate. With the rear seats in place, you have 500 litres of space back here, which is a significant amount. Although it is worth pointing out that because this car is all-wheel drive, it's not a very tall space, which means that if you do have luggage bags and so on, you're going to have to lie them flat rather than put them on their side, for example. Although, of course, you can always remove the tonneau cover and then you have a little bit more space, but the sloping roofline does mean that clearance, height clearance, might be a little bit of an issue. And before you ask, there is no space underneath the boot floor, because that's taken up by a full-size spare wheel, replete with the same Michelin E-Primacy tires, which means that if you do suffer from a flat somewhere along your journey, you can actually change it yourself, which is certainly nice to see. And of course, if you want even more space, you can fold the rear seats flat 60/40, which then creates a space in excess of about 1600 or 1700 litres overall, which makes this a really, really practical car. And all of that for, what, 170 grand? Now, inside the Omoda C9, unfortunately, there is no dedicated sunglasses holder, which means that once again, I just have to chuck my sunglasses. But that sense of style that we saw from the outside actually carries into the cabin, because this interior is unlike anything we've ever seen from the Chery group of companies. And that's because this interior looks to be built towards a slightly higher standard than what we've seen before. In terms of the material quality, even the plastic wood in this car actually looks to be of a higher quality than we've seen before. And the overall design of this car just looks really posh. So in terms of materials, we get soft touch materials up here and even more soft touch materials down here. This is even stitched as well to sort of improve that perceived quality, which is certainly nice to see. The upholstery on the seats are actually Napa leather, which means that they are very soft. And in terms of the way they feel, in terms of the texture, it actually feels a little bit more like semi-aniline leather rather than sort of natural leather that you get in a lot of other cars, which means that it does feel very upmarket. On top of that, this might sound a bit weird, but there's a smell in this car that smells like proper leather, like what I used to get from my old Mercedes. And so again, at this price point, these are all very good things. Now, moving beyond that, obviously you get a couple of digital instruments up ahead of you. You get a 12.5-inch screen on the left that runs all of your infotainment functions, which means that you also get wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, as well as your air conditioning controls, etc. That's all done through here. You get another digital screen up ahead of me to do your instrumentation, which gives you your speed and your RPM, etc., and also provides a pretty solid display for your ADAS functions, which means that this car is quite reliable in terms of being able to inform you of what it can see at any given time. So that's certainly a good thing. On top of that, there's also a heads-up display which does broadly the same thing. It gives you your ADAS readout as well as your speed, etc., which means that you can keep your sight ahead at all times while still having all the relevant information right in front of you. It is just unfortunate, however, that no matter how I try it, the heads-up display doesn't give me turn-by-turn directions when I use phone mirroring, which means that I still have to move my gaze here, but because the Android Auto takes up the entirety of the screen, that's not really a bad thing. Now, beyond that, there are actually some tactile buttons in this car. So while the volume control in this is via a touch sensor, your air conditioning controls as well as your drive mode selector are actually done by a set of physical buttons here. So you have one knob here to control your fan speed as well as your recirculation, one knob to control your temperature as well as your demisters front and rear, and then you have the central knob which controls your drive mode. You also get buttons for your AC and automatic modes just on either side, which I think is a nice blend of digital and tactile, which means that when you're driving along, you can adjust your temperature very easily. It is unfortunate, however, that if you have your phone mirroring system on, you then don't have a display for your temperature, which means that if you move this from left to right, you don't actually know what temperature you're setting it at. And so if you don't remember where you've put it, you won't actually know how much you're adjusting it by based on the clicks that it makes. Anyway, moving further down, you get a wireless phone charger on one side as well as another sort of placeholder here, which is where I've been putting my access cards. This wireless charge is actually of 50 watts, and it even has a little bit of cooling at the back, which means that if you were to put a device here, it should remain cool without too much issue. Moving further down, you actually get a set of cup holders here, as well as a felt line cubby here, which means that anything that you put in here won't rattle. And something that I found quite interesting is that the cubby hole here can actually be lifted to reveal a little bit of hidden storage space underneath, which means that if you have any particularly valuable items that are small, you can fit them down here. So that's certainly very nice. You also get a decently sized center console bin here with a bit of rubber lining on the bottom, which even comes with an air conditioning vent in here in order to cool items that you keep within the car. So that's certainly nice to see. And of course, because this car's gear selector is on this side, it means that down here there's even more space for stuff. So as you can see, we've got a tissue box holder here. There are a couple of USB-C ports on this side, as well as a 12-volt socket. So that's certainly nice to see. Beyond that, you've got decently sized door bins, big enough for a 1.5 litre size bottle. Your seat controls live here on the door panel, which actually looks very similar to what we've seen from Mercedes-Benz. And you even get memory functionality for the driver's seat, as well as ventilation for both sides. One thing about these seats I'd like to point out is the fact that you actually have adjustable under-thigh support, which means that the furthest edge of the seat can actually be rolled out in order to provide more support for the backs of your thighs. But it is unfortunate that we still don't have angle adjustment. So you get one, but not the other. I don't understand what the point is of that. But you also have now this new 4-spoke steering wheel. This is a unique item, at least unique to the Omoda C9 for now. And it comes with some touch-sensitive buttons in a similar layout and pattern that we've seen before from the J-Coupe J7 PHEV, as well as the Chery Omoda E5, the electric SUV. And so the use of these buttons are fine. They're just as you'd expect. The same goes for the stalks, which is again lifted out of the Omoda E5. But here we actually have physical paddle shifters in order to manipulate the 8-speed automatic gearbox. Now, the action of them is very nice, but the feel of them is not so great. And if you don't press them at the right angle, they have a little bit of flex to them, which is not so nice. But again, this is 170 grand starting, 185 grand max, which means this is fine. On top of that, you also get your 14-speaker Sony audio system and a standard fit panoramic sunroof, which is great when you're filming because otherwise this interior is a little bit dark. Now, because the Omoda C9 is a D-segment SUV, there is absolutely palatial amount of space in the back of the car. With the front seat set in my driving position, I'm about 170 centimeters. You can see I have acres of knee room. And despite the fact this car has a sloping roofline, as well as that standard fit panoramic sunroof, I actually have a pretty decent amount of headroom. And so life back here is really not that bad. On top of that, I have air conditioning vents not only here in the middle, which is mounted high enough for it not to be called a crotch cooler, but I also have vents here on the B pillar, which means that I can actually get air conditioning directly to my face, which means that life back here is quite comfortable. Each passenger in the rear technically has their own air conditioning vent, so nobody has to fight for that sort of thing. So that's nice. On top of that, to add to the luxury amenities back here, I also have electrically adjustable rear seat recline, which means that just by moving this button, I can adjust the angle with which I sit. This is a feature that I've only seen before from the Toyota Camry, which is now, what, a 240,000 ringgit vehicle in hybrid guise, which means that this is very affordable in that regard. Now, there are a few things about this car that I'd like to point out before I get to things I don't like. You get boss switches for this seat, which means that if you want to move it further away to make more room for passengers in the rear, you can do that. You also have controls back here for your fan speed, as well as for the heated rear seats. Now, it is unfortunate this is not a climate control button, so you can't change the temperature, but at least by being able to change the fan speed, that should allow you to get pretty comfortable back here. Now, onto the things that I'm not a big fan of. Firstly, the rear seat base appears to be mounted a little bit too low, which means that as I'm sat here, as you can see, I don't have that much in terms of under thigh support. However, if I were to stretch my feet out underneath the seat in front of me, which I can do very easily, then it is quite comfortable. Also, the rear seats are not as scalloped as I would like, which means that as I'm sat here, I am noticing that I don't have that much in terms of lateral support, which means that if my driver intends to drive a little bit faster and takes a corner, for example, I might end up sliding out of my seat. Also, it is unfortunate that the only USB ports actually hide in this little panel down here, where you have a single USB-A and USB-C port. Being mounted that low means that it is a little bit more difficult to access it compared to having USB ports mounted on, say, the seat backs, for example. But overall, these are really very minor niggles. You have this deployable center armrest here, which is at a lovely angle with a couple of cup holders, and these headrests can actually be adjusted like you do on, say, a business class seat, and so it actually holds your head in place quite nicely. So if you were to recline this seat, for example, you could very comfortably take in a nap without too much issue. Now, because these rear seats have ISOFIX mounts and because this car has relatively long wheelbase, it shouldn't be an issue fitting a bulky rear-facing child seat in here at all. And that's a good thing because you can't fit one in the front seat, which means that these are the only seats where you can mount a child seat. So overall, life back here is pretty good. And in terms of material quality, which I'm just only remembering to bring up now because it is as stunning as it is, everything back here is just a soft touch. You still get that same sort of stitched leather here, stitched leather here. You even get stitched leather around this center console area, which again just makes this car look and feel really upmarket. You also get an ambient lighting system in this car, which stretches all the way to the rear. And overall, I think the Omoda C9 has been positioned really, really well as a premium or luxury car competitor. Now, I would like to point out the fact that this is not a luxury car because the Omoda brand doesn't quite have the same cachet as you would need to be considered a luxury car, primarily. And secondly, ultimately, this is being billed as a more cost-efficient alternative to something like a Mercedes-Benz E-Class or a BMW 5 Series. And that becomes very, very clear from behind the wheel. Now, before I get into the Omoda C9, I'd like to first paint a little bit of context. Although at this price point, this car has many, many competitors, I think this car's two primary competitors are the Toyota Harrier and the Mazda CX-8, because both of those models share the sort of buyers who are looking for cars that feel premium and upmarket and also have a potential of them being used as chauffeur-driven vehicles. And I have no doubt that vehicles like the Omoda C9 certainly have potential in that regard. Now, with that in mind, the Toyota Harrier costs about 240,000-260,000 ringgit, which makes it significantly more expensive than the Omoda C9. On the other hand, the Mazda CX-8 can be had for significantly less because just like the Omoda, the Mazda is also locally assembled, which means that it also benefits from certain tax reductions, etc. And so if you were to compare this car against those competitors, the Omoda C9 actually measures up pretty well. So firstly, there is obviously the size. The Omoda C9 being a two-row, five-seater SUV, more in line with what you get from, say, the Toyota Harrier, means that you get a car with a lot of space, not only in the front, but also in the rear, and particularly in the rear, in fact. The wheelbase of this car is also significantly larger than what you get from, say, a C-segment SUV, which means that a lot of that benefit comes in terms of rear seat comfort and accommodation. And if you were to compare this to the Toyota Harrier, for example, this is a significantly larger car compared to that. And so in addition to having a significant amount more in terms of road presence, you also get a significant amount more in terms of both practicality as well as space for people. So that's certainly a good thing. However, in terms of the way it drives, there are some significant differences here. So within this segment, we actually look very favorably upon the Toyota Harrier because although it does have a naturally aspirated motor with a CVT automatic gearbox, which is perhaps not as spicy as what we got from the last generation model where we had a 2-liter turbocharged engine as well as I believe it was a torque converter automatic gearbox, it's still fine because the platform is lighter, which means the car drives a little bit more pointedly. It drives very positively and it feels very posh and very plush from behind the wheel and from, in fact, within any seat within the cabin. But if you were to compare that to, say, the Mazda CX-8, now the Mazda CX-8 feels a completely different animal because, of course, the naturally aspirated motor you get in that is a 2.5 litre, one of the best engines that Mazda currently makes, which not only provides a necessary amount of power and torque, but is also reasonably efficient even if driven intently. Although, of course, you can also get the 2.5 litre turbo or the 2.2 litre turbo diesel, but they both have their pros and cons. And so compared to that, the Omoda C9 does appear to strike a balance because you have a 2-liter turbocharged engine up front, you have an 8-speed automatic gearbox. You also get the option of all-wheel drive, something that neither of those cars offer, at least with an engine this small. If you want all-wheel drive in the CX-8, you have to get the 2.5 turbo, which consumes a significant amount more fuel than V8s, for that matter. But regardless, the Omoda C9 seems to offer a pretty compelling package in that regard. And then when you drive it, it feels like a very different car. Firstly, I'm frankly stunned at just how smooth this powertrain is. When I drove the Jayco J7 with the 7-speed dual clutch automatic gearbox, I remarked that that car didn't quite carry itself with the same sort of polish that you would expect from a vehicle that is claiming some premium and upmarket pretensions. And of course, even the Proton X70 would make a JQ J7 feel lumpen in comparison. So getting into this, I appreciate just how smooth this powertrain is. It's exactly what you want, again, for something that is claiming to be premium and upmarket and etc. and is targeting the sort of customers who would have traditionally bought a Toyota Camry or maybe even a base Mercedes-Benz E-Class. And then there is the matter of refinement. So for starters, although this is a 2-litre turbocharged 4-cylinder, because it has that 400 Newton meters of torque and because it has 8 ratios to play with, this car never really has to rev out very hard in order to sort of get itself going. Instead, the car seems to understand where torque is and how to access it, and so it keeps the engine speed at a reasonable sort of level so that it never gets too intrusive into the cabin. When you take that into account, it means that progress in this car is very smooth, not just at urban speeds but also out on the motorway. Although I will admit that when you do want this car to overtake, for example, when you give it sudden throttle inputs, it does take a second or two to sort of figure out what it has to do in terms of selecting which ratio. A small matter overall. And then of course, when you are driving it around, be it in town or again out on the motorway, you'll appreciate just how comfortable this car is. So for starters, these seats are very, very plush. The seat squabs themselves are nice and soft, which means that when you sit in the car, it feels like you sink into the seat, so that's always a nice thing. Although it is unfortunate that we don't get any sort of side bolster support either from the seat base or from the backrest. So it does mean that when you are driving quickly, you may find yourself sliding out of the seat if you again drive a little bit too exuberantly. But beyond the seats is also the matter of overall refinement. So again, that engine remains very quiet. And then there is the matter of outside noises. So road roar in this car is very, very impressively damped. You don't hear anything from these Michelin tires until you hit speeds well north of the national speed limit. And so it always means that life in this car remains quite comfortable in that regard. And then there is the fact that this car comes with laminated glass, which means that in terms of wind noise and the sound of traffic, etc., that is also very, very well insulated from the cabin. As a result, it means that doing progress in this car is a very smooth, very calm, very comfortable affair. And it's certainly the sort of thing that you'd be quite happy to do distance in if need be. And then you have the steering. Now, this is a bit of a hit and miss because on the one hand, you get absolutely zero feedback from the steering wheel, although that is quite common with a lot of electric power-assisted steering systems nowadays anyway. Although it is decently accurate, that complete sense of numbness between you and the road does mean that it does take away some degree of confidence when you want to drive this car exuberantly. It also means that you will second guess yourself if you're trying to take corners at higher speed, if you're cruising at higher speed, for example, if you're on the motorway. However, to me, it just feels like a perfectly decent operator. The sort of things that I complain about are not the sort of things that are going to concern a lot of people, or most people for that matter. For most people, they'll appreciate the fact that the steering wheel weights up very naturally, which means that even as speed piles on, it never feels that you're disconnected from the front wheels. You feel that you are always in control of the car, and that's always a good thing. And then, of course, they'll also appreciate the fact that when you put in additional steering input at lower speeds, like when you're parking or when you're maneuvering around tighter spaces, for example, the 360 camera is automatically activated in the center console infotainment system in order to give you a commanding view around, which is certainly helpful given the fact that the view out can be sometimes limited, especially over the rear three-quarter. However, that does lead me on to one thing about this car that is not so great, and that is the Advanced Driver Assist Systems, or ADAS functionality. Now, we have complained about this before in the JQ J7 as well as other Chery products, in that the ADAS functions in these cars feel a little bit unpolished. The car likes to sort of hunt and second guess itself, and it also reacts very suddenly to sudden changes in traffic conditions. So for example, if a car were to cut into your queue, instead of gently bringing you and maintaining the speed that it's supposed to, it sort of slams on the brakes very suddenly, like a learner driver getting surprised by a new car, for example. And then when it accelerates back up to speed, it tends to do so again in a very sort of amateurish kind of way, because it's very gentle on the throttle initially, and then when the gap builds up, it suddenly becomes very aggressive on the throttle. And then if you're in stop-start traffic and the vehicle in front of you then comes to a halt, the car will then slam on the anchors. So it just it's just not very polished. On the motorway, it is a little bit better because it maintains speed very well. It doesn't scrub speed through corners, which is always nice to see. And so, again, in that regard, this car is totally fine. But it's just a shame that I'm not getting better traffic jam assist, especially because I suspect that a lot of Omoda C9 buyers will be driving this car through the urban sprawl most of the time. And that brings me on to yet another matter which I think is worth highlighting in this car. So if you were to drive on a motorway run, for example, then you will find that this car is decently efficient. Now, again, driven on the motorway at a relatively steady speed, you will be able to realize fuel economy figures as low as 7.5 liters to the 100, which is certainly very good for a vehicle this big and certainly this heavy. However, when you drive about in town, especially if you get stuck in traffic and stuff like that, that's when things start to fall apart a little. As I mentioned before, this engine is actually shared with the Tiggo 8 Pro, and so we understand broadly how thirsty this engine can get. And the situation hasn't really improved much in the Omoda C9. If driven through stop-start traffic, you'll be able to see figures as high as 14 liters to the 100. Now, of course, this is this is driving through especially bad traffic. Although, again, if driven on the motorway, it's not that bad. And so you have to take into account how this car is going to be used if numbers like that are something that put you off. If you're looking for a vehicle to barnstorm up and down the motorway, do long distance trips, etc., then I think the Omoda C9 is a perfectly practical vehicle. However, if you're looking for a large SUV to drive primarily in town and you want something that is slightly more fuel efficient, then you may be better served by vehicles like the new Hyundai Santa Fe Hybrid, which when we drove it, that car would comfortably do about 900 kilometers on a full tank. And because it's not a plug-in hybrid vehicle, it means that there's no extra faffing about in terms of actually extracting that kind of fuel economy. But of course, if you're also doing a lot of motorway runs and you're looking at a large SUV in order to cover a lot of distance very frequently, then you might actually be better served by the Mazda CX-8 because you can purchase that vehicle and drive that around as a 2.2 litre turbo diesel. Now, so specified, that car will comfortably do 1,000 kilometers on a full tank, which means that again you can enjoy real-world efficiency while not compromising in terms of overall performance. However, if you want a large SUV that seems to do very, very well at pretending to be a premium car by offering a really premium experience for really not that much money, then I think the Omoda C9 does put a really good foot forward. I have to keep reminding myself that this car tops out at under 190,000 ringgit, and with that in mind, this car is incredibly well specified. It drives decently well, it's very comfortable, it is very quiet, and it's very, very well specified. And so in that regard, I don't really have very many complaints. However, I will end this review by saying that some spy shots have recently been unearthed showing an Omoda C9 plugging in at a DC fast charger, which seems to suggest that JCO Malaysia may be looking at bringing the plug-in hybrid variant of this car, which might use the same Supra hybrid system that we've seen from the JCO J7 PHEV. If so specified, this car would not only be more powerful, but also more efficient and a lot better equipped to drive about in town. So if you're looking at a Omoda C9, maybe you ought to wait for that. But in any case, that concludes our review of the new Omoda C9 all-wheel drive. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon to be notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. We will catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe and jangan bodoh.